Sometimes the quietest homes hide the loudest secrets. What began as an ordinary night of babysitting my little granddaughter turned into a nightmare I never expected. One whispered sentence from her changed everything, forcing me to make a decision no grandmother should ever face. To respect the privacy of those involved, I've changed their names and locations, but the story you're about to hear is real, raw, and unforgettable. Please listen closely and follow along. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do so now so you won't miss the next story. Don't forget to like this video and leave a comment saying I'm listening so we can stay connected on this journey together. It was a crisp autumn evening in the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon. Margaret Hayes, a 67-year-old widow, had lived alone for years in her small cedar-sided house at 3210 Maple Street. The place still smelled faintly of wood smoke and lavender from her late husband's pipe and her own hand-sewn sachets. She had been setting a kettle on the stove for tea when a soft but urgent knock rattled the front door. The wind outside hissed through the maples lining the street, scattering red and gold leaves across her porch like confetti. When she opened the door, the first thing she noticed wasn't the cold air sliding in but the look on her daughter-in-law's face. Sarah Whitmore, only 32 but usually composed in her neat St. Mary's Hospital scrubs, stood there with a wrinkled coat thrown over her shoulders. Her hands trembled around the straps of a worn leather bag, knuckles white. She kept glancing back over her shoulder toward the dimly lit street as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. The street lamp at the corner flickered, throwing jerky silhouettes of the trees across the sidewalk. "Mom, I'm sorry to drop her off again," Sarah said, her voice tight and brittle. "It's just for one night. My shift at the hospital," she trailed off, licking her lips, eyes darting behind her once more. Margaret tightened her shawl against the draft and forced a warm smile. "It's all right, Sarah. You know Emma is always welcome here." But Sarah didn't seem to hear. She knelt to adjust Emma's fraying sweater sleeves, hands moving fast, like she couldn't stay still. "Be good for Grandma, okay, sweetheart?" "Just one night," she murmured, her voice low, urgent. Emma, a slight 6-year-old with messy blonde hair, clutched a floppy white stuffed rabbit named Snowy to her chest. Her eyes, usually bright, looked wide and uncertain tonight. She pressed herself into her mother's side and whispered something inaudible into the rabbit's ear. Margaret crouched down and stroked Emma's shoulder. "Hi, darling," she said gently. "Come on inside, it's warm." Sarah straightened up but still hovered at the threshold, glancing again toward the street. For the third time she asked, "Mom, you don't mind, do you?" "Really, you don't?" Her voice trembled, almost breaking. Margaret reached out and touched her arm. "No, of course not. You go do what you have to. She'll be safe here." For a brief second their eyes met, and Margaret saw something flicker there, fear, or a plea, she couldn't tell. Then Sarah bent down, kissed Emma's forehead and whispered, "Sleep well, my love. Mommy will come get you tomorrow." The words were so soft Margaret barely caught them. Then she turned and hurried down the steps, her thin frame swallowed by the shadows of the street. The door shut with a muted thud, and only then did Margaret feel the chill seep into her bones. The porch light flickered, and a gust rattled the window panes. She stood in her hallway holding Emma's small hand, the stuffed rabbit dangling between them, and felt a strange heaviness settle over her chest, a gnawing sense, as clear as the wind moaning outside, that a storm was coming and nothing would be the same again. Sarah stood on the small wooden porch, the fading daylight of Portland filtering through the maple branches overhead. The street at this hour was strangely quiet, only the distant groan of a bus climbing the hill and the faint bark of a dog somewhere down the block broke the silence. The porch light buzzed faintly, casting an amber circle around her feet. In its glow Margaret noticed how tightly Sarah's fingers clutched the straps of her canvas tote. Her knuckles had turned pale, almost translucent, as if she were holding on for dear life. Margaret stepped closer, rubbing her hands against her sweater for warmth. "Sarah," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady, "what's wrong, dear? You look shaken." Sarah's eyes flicked nervously toward the street, then to the hedge along the walkway, as if she expected someone to jump out. Her usually neat brown hair was hastily tied back, a few strands sticking to her damp forehead. She tried to muster a smile, but it wavered and disappeared. Without answering Margaret directly, she bent down to Emma, who clung to her leg, small fingers twisting the ear of her worn-out stuffed rabbit. "Sweetheart," Sarah whispered, tucking a stray curl behind Emma's ear, "be good for Grandma tonight, okay? Mommy will be back soon. Sleep tight." Her voice cracked on the last word, like glass under pressure. Margaret watched the scene with a growing knot in her chest. She'd seen Sarah tired before, after long shifts at St. Mary's Hospital, after nights when Emma had been sick, but she had never seen her daughter-in-law like this. There was something urgent, frightened, almost secretive in her movements. Margaret reached out a hand to Emma, who was pressed against her mother's thigh like a small bird seeking shelter. "Come on in, darling," Margaret said gently. "It's warm inside." Emma glanced up at her grandmother with wide, uncertain eyes but didn't move. Sarah gave her a little nudge and then, finally, looked up at Margaret. Their eyes met, Sarah's dark and glistening under the porch light, and for a fleeting second Margaret thought she saw something in them, a plea, or a warning. "Everything's fine," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. She straightened abruptly, adjusted the strap of her bag, and without another word started down the steps. Her boots clattered against the wooden stairs, the sound sharp in the still evening. "Sarah," Margaret began, but stopped herself. Sarah raised a trembling hand in a quick wave without turning back, her thin figure quickly swallowed by the lengthening shadows of Maple Street. The smell of damp leaves drifted in on a gust of wind as Margaret shut the door. The latch clicked, echoing through the quiet house. She stood there for a long moment with her palms still on the wood, feeling the cold seep through. A shiver passed over her shoulders. Somewhere deep inside, a warning bell had begun to ring, a sense that whatever Sarah was carrying tonight had just crossed her threshold too. Margaret led Emma gently down the narrow hallway into the heart of her home, the small pine-paneled kitchen that always smelled of rosemary and simmering broth. The old ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, making the hanging copper pans clink softly against each other. On the stove, a heavy pot of beef and potato stew bubbled lazily, filling the air with a rich, earthy aroma that reminded Margaret of Sunday dinners when her son Alex was still alive. She had made it today with that memory in mind, hoping to bring a little comfort to Emma. "Come on, sweetheart," Margaret said, pulling out a chair at the worn oak table. "Sit here. Let's get you something warm in your tummy." Emma slid onto the chair without a word, her small frame almost lost in the oversized sweater she wore. She still held Snowy, the stuffed rabbit, its once white fur now gray and flattened from years of hugging. She rested her chin on Snowy's head, eyes fixed on the steaming bowl in front of her but not really seeing it. "I made your Uncle Alex's favorite," Margaret continued softly, more to fill the silence than anything. "Beef stew with potatoes and carrots. He always said it tasted like home." She placed a spoon next to Emma's bowl and sat down across from her. "Go on, darling, have a little taste." Emma's voice came out as a whisper, almost swallowed by the creak of the old house. "I'm not hungry, Grandma." She didn't look up. Margaret's heart pinched. She reached across the table and tucked a stray lock of hair behind Emma's ear. "That's all right," she said gently, forcing a smile. "You're probably just tired. Maybe a few bites later." The television in the living room flickered with a Disney cartoon, bright colors, cheerful songs, but its sound only leaked faintly into the kitchen. Emma didn't even glance at it. She sat still, staring into the stew as though it might reveal some secret she couldn't speak. Margaret noticed how Emma's small hands clutched Snowy tighter with every passing minute, her knuckles white just like her mother's had been earlier. Margaret stirred her own bowl slowly, her spoon making small circles in the broth. She opened her mouth to ask about school, about friends, anything, but the words died before they left her lips. The air in the kitchen felt warm but heavy, like the tense stillness before a thunderstorm. Finally she tried again, her voice tentative. "Did you and Mommy do anything fun today?" Emma blinked but didn't answer. Her eyes, when she finally looked up, were wide and empty, not like the lively little girl Margaret remembered. She swallowed her question and instead reached over, giving Emma's hand a soft squeeze. "It's okay, baby," she murmured. "You're safe here." But even as she said it, Margaret felt a chill creep up her spine, a sense that something dark and unspoken had crossed her threshold along with her granddaughter. Margaret unfolded the old cot with a soft metallic creak and set it up beside the recliner that had once belonged to her late husband. The chair still held the faint scent of his aftershave and the imprint of countless evenings spent reading the newspaper while she knitted. She pulled a faded quilt from the cedar chest, one she had sewn years ago from scraps of Alex's old shirts, and spread it carefully across the cot. The living room glowed in a muted amber light from a single floor lamp, shadows of the maple trees outside swayed gently across the walls. "Here we go, sweetheart," she whispered, patting the pillow. "You'll sleep right next to Grandma tonight." Emma climbed onto the cot without a word. She turned away, pressing her small body to the wall, clutching Snowy so tightly the stuffed rabbit's ears bent backward. Her thin shoulders rose and fell with a deep sigh that sounded far too heavy for a 6-year-old. Margaret felt the sound like a pinprick to her heart. It was the same hollow sigh she had heard from herself during those sleepless nights after Alex's accident on the construction site, the nights when only the ticking of the clock and her own grief kept her company. She knelt by the cot, smoothing the quilt over Emma's small frame. "Are you warm enough, baby?" she asked softly, brushing a stray curl from the girl's forehead. Emma gave the smallest nod but didn't look at her. Margaret wanted desperately to gather her granddaughter into her arms, to tell her that she was safe here, but she hesitated. Something in Emma's rigid posture warned her not to startle the child. She sat back on her heels, fingers twisting together in her lap, watching the girl's profile in the dim light. The house was so quiet she could hear the refrigerator humming faintly from the kitchen and the soft tap of branches against the windowpane. The old clock on the mantel read 11:47. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to pray, but her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. A soft, broken sound snapped her awake. Emma's voice, faint, quivering, slipped out from the darkness. "Grandma, don't leave me alone." Margaret's heart clenched. She moved quickly to the cot, sitting on the edge. "Shoo, honey, Grandma's right here," she murmured, laying a gentle hand on Emma's trembling shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere." Emma didn't open her eyes. Her brow furrowed, lips pressed together as if holding back some great fear even in sleep. Margaret stroked the girl's hair in slow, steady motions, whispering, "You're safe, baby, I promise." But inside, a cold unease spread through her chest, a nameless dread that crept deeper with every passing minute. She stayed there until Emma's breathing steadied again, her own thoughts circling the same silent question: what has this child seen that weighs so heavily on her small heart? The first gray light of dawn crept through the blinds, painting thin golden stripes across the kitchen floor. Margaret was already awake, standing barefoot on the cool linoleum, her robe tied tightly around her. She cracked eggs into a cast-iron skillet with practiced motions, the yolk sizzling as soon as they hit the butter. On the counter, slices of bread popped up from the old toaster with a metallic click, releasing a warm, yeasty smell. She poured cocoa powder into a pan of milk, stirring slowly until the steam curled up in sweet ribbons. "Emma will like this," she murmured to herself, the words soft but steady. "Just like Alex when he was little." Saying his name out loud made her chest tighten. It was her small ritual, making breakfast the way she used to when her son still came running down these same stairs, hair sticking up, eyes bright. She wanted Emma to feel that warmth now, to feel safe, normal, loved. Yet even as she worked, a quiet unease coiled in her stomach. She could sense it in the silence of the house, in the way the morning light felt pale rather than bright. The smell of food filled the kitchen, but it did nothing to chase away the chill in her heart. From the hallway came the sound of slow, hesitant footsteps. Margaret turned and saw Emma standing in the doorway, small and rumpled. Her hair was tangled into little knots from tossing in her sleep, her eyes puffy and red as though she'd been crying for hours. Snowy dangled from her hand, one ear dragging against the floor. "Good morning, sweetheart," Margaret said gently, forcing a smile. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and crouched a little to be at Emma's level. "Did you sleep well?" Emma kept her gaze fixed on the floorboards, her lips pressed together. She gave a tiny shrug but said nothing. Margaret's smile wavered, but she turned back to the skillet, flipping the eggs with a practiced flick of her wrist. She tried to keep her tone light, as if it were just another ordinary morning. I made your favorite, scrambled eggs, toast, and hot cocoa. Come sit at the table, darling. It's all ready. Emma shuffled to a chair, climbing up slowly as though every movement cost her effort. She placed Snowy on her lap and hugged the toy tight, chin resting on its matted head. Margaret set a plate before her, the eggs steaming, toast browned just right. She poured the cocoa into a mug, the scent of chocolate rising between them. For a moment, the kitchen looked like a picture of domestic peace, the kind you might see in an old magazine, the warm food, the soft morning light, the grandmother and granddaughter sitting together. But underneath it all, Margaret felt the tension like a low hum. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the mug down. She watched Emma poke at the toast without taking a bite. The child's silence was heavier than words. Margaret swallowed hard, the taste of coffee bitter on her tongue. Something's wrong, she thought, her mind circling the memory of Sarah's trembling hands the night before. The smell of breakfast couldn't mask it, and the morning light couldn't soften it. Margaret reached across the table and touched Emma's small knuckles gently. It's okay, baby, she whispered. Grandma's here. Emma still didn't look up. The only sound was the tick of the kitchen clock and the faint sizzle from the pan cooling on the stove, a fragile piece that felt as though it could shatter at any second. Margaret pulled out a chair at the small oak kitchen table, the one her late husband had built years ago. She brushed a few breadcrumbs off the surface with her palm, trying to create a welcoming space. Come on, sweetheart, sit down here, she said softly. Emma hesitated at the edge of the kitchen, her little fingers digging into Snowy's worn fur. After a moment, she climbed onto the chair, her legs swinging above the floor, clutching the toy rabbit as if it were a life preserver. Margaret turned back to the stove, lifting the warm plate of scrambled eggs she had just finished. She placed it carefully in front of Emma, along with a slice of toast cut diagonally. The smell of butter and cocoa filled the room, but it felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Margaret tucked a strand of gray hair behind her ear and forced a cheerful tone. There you go, darling. Eat a little, it will make you feel better. Emma stared at the plate, but she didn't move. Her small shoulders rose and fell with a long, shaky breath. She looked even smaller in the morning light slanting through the blinds. Margaret noticed her granddaughter's knuckles whitening around Snowy's paw and felt her own chest tighten. She had been a mother long enough to recognize a child holding back something. Then Emma's voice came, a fragile whisper, so soft it almost drowned under the ticking clock on the wall. Grandma. Mom said. I'm not supposed to tell you what I saw at home. Margaret froze. The spatula in her hand trembled and nearly slipped onto the tile floor. Time seemed to slow, the sound of the refrigerator hum becoming deafening. She set the spatula down with deliberate care and turned toward Emma. Sweetheart, she said gently, her voice low but urgent, look at me. Emma kept her gaze fixed on the table, her lips pressed together. Her small chest heaved with quick, shallow breaths. Margaret walked around the table and knelt beside the chair so that her eyes were level with Emma's. She reached out and placed a hand over Emma's clenched fingers. Darling, you're safe here, she murmured. Grandma's here. You can tell me anything, I promise. You're not in trouble. Emma's lower lip quivered. She bit down on it as tears welled up in her big, brown eyes. Snowy slipped a little from her grip and dangled by one ear. Margaret could see the struggle on the girl's face, the fear of betraying her mother versus the need to let the secret out. The kitchen felt as if it were shrinking, the air thick, every tick of the clock loud and insistent. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled by and then the street went silent again. Margaret waited, stroking Emma's knuckles with her thumb in slow circles. Emma sniffled, a small sound that seemed too heavy for her age. She turned her head slightly toward Margaret, eyes glistening, her voice no more than a trembling breath. Grandma, she began, but the words broke off. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Margaret cupped the back of Emma's head gently. "It's okay," she whispered, her own heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Take your time. You can tell me when you're ready." For a moment neither of them moved. The only sound was the steady tick-tick-tick of the kitchen clock, marking the seconds before everything would change. Emma's little hands trembled so violently that Snowy nearly slipped from her grasp. Her voice was thin, broken, and almost swallowed by the low hum of the refrigerator. "Grandma," she whispered, pausing to swallow hard. There's a boy locked in the shed behind our house. He keeps crying and says he's hurt." The words hit Margaret like a thunderclap. For a moment she couldn't even breathe. The spoon she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the tile with a sharp clang, the sound echoing through the quiet kitchen. The glass of milk beside Emma wobbled and tipped over, spilling in a pale stream across the table. Margaret stared at her granddaughter, stunned, her heart thudding in her chest like a drum. What did you say?" she asked, her voice hoarse. But Emma had already started to cry, her small shoulders shaking. She dropped Snowy to the floor and launched herself into Margaret's arms as if the older woman were the only safe place left in the world. Margaret wrapped her arms tightly around the child, feeling the tremor in her tiny frame. "Shoo, sweetheart, I've got you," she murmured, but her own voice trembled. She could feel Emma's tears soaking through the fabric of her sweater. Inside Margaret's mind, 1,000 images collided. Alex, her only son, laughing as he built that same shed 15 years ago, hammer in hand, while little Sarah, just a teenager then, passed him nails. Back then the yard had been full of voices and sunlight. Now, the memory felt like a cruel contrast to Emma's words. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut. A boy locked in the shed? Crying, hurt? The phrase repeated over and over. Her stomach churned. She wanted to believe Emma had imagined it, a nightmare, a story from a cartoon. But the terror in the child's eyes was too real, too raw. Emma clutched at her grandmother's sweater, hiccuping between sobs. "He said his arm hurts," she whispered into Margaret's neck. "He said no one listens to him," her small fists balled up tighter. Margaret pulled back just enough to look into Emma's tear-streaked face. "Sweetheart, are you sure? You really saw this boy?" she asked gently. Emma nodded, a quick, desperate movement. The kitchen seemed colder suddenly, despite the warm smell of cocoa and toast still lingering in the air. Margaret's hands trembled as she stroked Emma's tangled hair. "Oh, my darling," she whispered, her throat tightening. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel the weight of the decision pressing in. She glanced toward the window, where the backyard shed sat hidden by autumn trees and drifting leaves in her memory. She remembered Alex's laughter, Sarah's shy smile when she first came into their lives, the promise of family. Now all she could see was a shadow of a child in pain. Margaret hugged Emma closer, her fingers gripping the back of the girl's sweater. In that moment she knew, with a terrible clarity, that this was not a story she could ignore. A real child, somewhere, might be suffering. And she, Margaret Hayes, a widow, a grandmother, might be the only person who could stop it. Margaret sat motionless at the kitchen table long after Emma's sobs had quieted. The girl was curled up on the old sofa in the next room, Snowy clutched tightly to her chest, her tiny body exhausted from crying. Margaret stared at the steam rising from her untouched mug of cocoa, feeling it warm her hands but not her heart. In her mind's eye she could still see Alex in the backyard 15 years ago, sun glinting off his hair as he hoisted a laughing, diaper-clad Emma high into the air. The memory came in bright flashes, Alex's booming laugh, Emma's squeal of delight, the smell of freshly cut grass. Those were the weekends when the Hayes house felt alive, a place of safety and joy. Now, the silence was deafening. Margaret rubbed her temples, the weight of Emma's whispered confession pressing down on her like a heavy stone. This is not a child's game, she thought, glancing toward the living room where the muted flicker of cartoons danced across Emma's tear-streaked face. She remembered Sarah as she had been years ago, shy but warm, always bringing over casseroles when Alex worked late. They had shared coffee at the same table, laughing about Emma's first steps. But tonight's Sarah, the one who left Emma at the door in a wrinkled coat, eyes darting like a trapped bird, was someone else entirely. Margaret's heart ached with confusion and worry. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the first pale streaks of autumn dawn were creeping across the yard. She pictured the shed behind Sarah's house that Emma had described. She remembered building it with Alex, the smell of cedar planks, the way his hands had guided the boards into place. It had been just a storage shed back then. Now, in Emma's story, it had turned into a prison for a child. Margaret's stomach twisted. She whispered to herself, almost afraid to hear the words out loud, "I can't stay silent." Her voice was barely a breath, but it felt like a vow. She clenched her hands together on the table, knuckles white, as if bracing for a storm. If what Emma says is true, she stopped, swallowing hard. The idea of a child suffering alone behind a locked door sent a shudder through her. From the living room came a small sound, Emma's soft sniffle. Margaret rose and walked to her granddaughter, kneeling beside the sofa. Emma's eyes were half closed, still wet with tears. Margaret stroked her hair gently. "Grandma's here, sweetheart." "I'm not going anywhere," she murmured. Inside, though, she felt a growing fire of resolve. She pictured Sarah's fleeting look before leaving, eyes wide, lips pressed as if she were about to speak but couldn't. Was it guilt? Was it a silent plea? The fragments of the night assembled in Margaret's mind like pieces of a grim puzzle. "I have to do something," she whispered, almost to herself, but Emma's fingers tightened around her hand as if she had heard. Margaret squeezed back, feeling the small pulse of life in that tiny hand. The decision formed fully in her heart then, she would not ignore this. Whatever the cost, she would find the truth and protect her granddaughter, and that unseen boy, from whatever darkness lay behind Sarah's locked doors. By midday the pale sun had burned through the morning mist, casting long beams of light across Maple Street. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she crossed the narrow strip of lawn that separated her little wooden house from Linda Cooper's neat brick bungalow next door. Her heart pounded harder with every step, the weight of Emma's confession still pressing on her chest. She had hardly slept, but she knew she couldn't keep silent anymore. Linda Cooper, 70 years old, was trimming her rose bushes by the side porch when she saw Margaret approaching. Her white hair was tied back in a scarf patterned with tiny violets. She straightened up, wiped her hands on her apron, and offered a tentative smile. "Morning, Margaret." "You're out early," she said, her voice warm but curious. Margaret tried to return the smile but couldn't quite manage it. "Linda, can we talk?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. Linda nodded immediately and led her up the steps to the porch. They settled into the wicker chairs that had been there for decades, the scent of fresh-cut roses drifting around them. For a moment, Margaret stared at her trembling hands folded in her lap. Then she took a deep breath. "Linda, I need to ask you something important," she began. Her voice cracked slightly. "Have you ever heard anything strange from Sarah's house? Any noises at night? Anything that seemed off?" Linda's friendly expression faded. She shifted in her chair, glancing toward the wooden fence that separated their yards from Sarah's property. "Well," she hesitated, lowering her voice as if the fence could listen. "2 nights ago, around midnight, I was putting the trash out when I heard something. It sounded like a child crying, faint but steady, coming from behind Sarah's house." She clasped her hands together, frowning. "I thought maybe her TV was turned up too loud, or Emma was having a nightmare. I didn't think much of it." Margaret's stomach clenched as if someone had twisted it. She gripped the armrest of her chair. "Linda, this is important," she said urgently. I think a child may be in danger there." Her voice trembled with both fear and determination. Linda reached over and laid a weathered hand on Margaret's shoulder. Her eyes, usually bright and teasing, were now serious and steady. "Margaret, I've known you for 30 years, she said firmly. "You're not one to invent stories. If you say something's wrong, I believe you." Those words landed like a lifeline. Margaret felt a sting of tears behind her eyes but blinked them away. "Thank you, Linda," she whispered, squeezing her neighbor's hand. You don't know how much this means to me. Linda gave her shoulder a gentle pat. If you need me to go with you to the police, I will, she offered quietly. No child should be crying alone at night. Margaret nodded, drawing in a shaky breath. The smell of roses and fresh earth filled her lungs, grounding her. For the first time since Emma's confession, she felt a flicker of strength. Someone believed her. She wasn't alone. The late afternoon light slanted through the lace curtains of Margaret's kitchen, striping the floor with thin bars of gold. The warmth of the sun did little to ease the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She sat at the small oak table, the receiver of her old cream-colored landline phone cradled in her trembling hands. For a moment she just stared at the keypad, her breath shallow. You have to do this, she told herself. If you don't, who will? With a shaky finger she dialed the number she had looked up that morning, the Portland Police Department's non-emergency line. The soft clicking of each number sounded louder than it should have. She pressed the phone to her ear, listening to the ring. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Portland Police Bureau, this is Officer Morales speaking. How can I help you? A calm male voice answered. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry. Hello, my name is Margaret Hayes, she began, her voice wavering but audible. I live at 3210 Maple Street, in the Northeast District. I believe there's a child being held somewhere they shouldn't be. I think they're in danger. There was a pause on the line, then Morales's voice took on a sharper edge. Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what you've seen or heard? Margaret's free hand gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. She forced herself to slow down, to speak clearly. It's my granddaughter, she said, glancing toward the living room. Emma sat on the couch hugging Snowy, her small legs tucked under her, eyes wide and watchful. She told me there's a boy locked in a shed behind my daughter-in-law's house. He's crying and says he's hurt. Her voice cracked on the last word. Do you have any confirmation of this, ma'am? Any witnesses? Morales asked gently. Yes, Margaret said quickly. My neighbor, Mrs. Cooper, she heard a child crying at night behind that house too. Please, she added, her voice trembling now, please send someone to check. I'm begging you. This isn't just a story. On the other end she could hear the soft tapping of keys, the officer taking notes. All right, Mrs. Hayes, Morales said after a moment. I'm forwarding this to our child welfare detectives immediately. We'll have someone contact you soon for more details. Margaret exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Thank you, she whispered, her hand shaking as she lowered the receiver back into its cradle. The click of the phone felt like a door closing, but also like one opening somewhere else. She sat for a moment, elbows on the table, covering her face with both hands. Her body shuddered as the tension drained from it, leaving only exhaustion and a fragile strand of hope. From the living room, Emma's small voice floated over. Grandma, she asked softly. Margaret looked up. Emma was still clutching Snowy, eyes wide and solemn. She didn't say anything else, but in her gaze was a question, a plea. Did you do it? Will someone help? Margaret rose from her chair and walked to the couch. She knelt in front of Emma, taking the little girl's hands in her own. I called for help, she said gently. People are going to listen now. We're not alone anymore. Emma blinked, a tear rolling down her cheek, and leaned into her grandmother's arms. Margaret held her tightly, feeling the small heartbeat against her own. In that embrace, for the first time all day, Margaret felt a flicker of strength return. She had taken the first step. Now all she could do was wait, and hope the system would move fast enough to save a child's life. The next morning, the small farmer's market on Maple Street buzzed with its usual Saturday rhythm, crates of apples glinting red under the pale autumn sun, the smell of fresh sourdough wafting from the bakery stall, the squeak of a cartwheel over the cracked pavement. Margaret Hayes clutched her canvas shopping bag, its straps worn smooth from years of use, and moved between the stalls with her head slightly bowed. She had promised herself she would act normal, that she would buy bread and milk like every week, but she could already feel the eyes on her. Two women she'd known for decades, Rita from the flower stand and Marjorie from the cheese counter, stood whispering behind a stack of pumpkins. Their voices weren't loud, but in the crisp morning air Margaret caught every word. "Poor Mrs. Hayes," Rita murmured. "Ever since her son died she's been seeing things, now she's accusing Sarah. She's not right in the head." Marjorie clucked softly. "It's sad, but she's old. Maybe she just misses her granddaughter too much." Margaret's jaw tightened. She adjusted the scarf under her chin, picked up a loaf of bread without really looking at it, and handed a few crumpled bills to the baker. She could feel the sting of tears but refused to let them show. She caged the pain behind a small, polite smile and a quiet thank you before hurrying back to her car. On the short drive home she gripped the steering wheel so hard her fingers ached. The old Ford smelled faintly of lavender from a sachet Emma had hung on the rearview mirror. They don't know anything, she thought, blinking hard at the traffic light. They don't know what I've seen in that child's eyes. Back at the little house on Maple, the warmth from the kitchen felt empty. Margaret set the bread on the counter and lowered herself into her husband's old recliner by the window. The chair sighed as it took her weight. She pressed her palm to her chest. Her heart felt like a stone. The phone on the side table buzzed sharply, making her jump. She snatched it up, hope flickering. Maybe the police? Maybe Officer Morales? But it was only a spam text offering discounted insurance. Margaret exhaled, her shoulders sagging. She whispered to herself, "No one believes me, but I can't give up. I can't." Just then Emma padded into the room, still in her soft flannel pajamas, snowy dangling from one hand. "Grandma," the girl said in a small, guilty voice. "I'm sorry I made you sad." Margaret reached out, pulling Emma gently onto her lap. She stroked the child's tangled hair, breathing in the scent of shampoo and sleep. "It's not your fault, sweetheart," she murmured. "You did nothing wrong. Grandma's going to take care of you, no matter what." Emma leaned against her, eyes shining but still shadowed by fear. Outside, the autumn wind threaded through the tall maples, making the branches creak and sigh like a long, mournful breath. Margaret held her granddaughter a little tighter, as if by sheer will she could shield the child from the whispers and the coming storm. That afternoon, the neighborhood on Maple Street was quiet except for the distant hum of a lawn mower and the occasional bark of a dog. Margaret was standing at her kitchen sink rinsing the breakfast dishes, the warm water running over her hands, when she noticed a moving truck across the street. Cardboard boxes were being carried into the small white house that had stood empty for months. A tall man with a graying beard directed the movers with an easy authority. A little while later, a firm but polite knock sounded at her front door. Margaret wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened it. Standing there was the same man, now holding a foil-wrapped apple pie that still smelled of cinnamon. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, voice deep but kind. "Name's Thomas Reed. I just moved in across the street. Thought I'd introduce myself." Margaret blinked, momentarily startled by the unexpected gesture. "Oh, hello," she managed, opening the door wider. "I'm Margaret Hayes." He gave a small nod, eyes crinkling at the corners. "I heard a few things from the neighbors already. Some gossip, you know how it is. People said you might be going through a hard time. I just wanted to check in and see if you're all right." Something about his steady gaze made Margaret's shoulders drop. "Please, come in," she said. She led him to the small kitchen, its checkered curtains swaying gently in the autumn breeze from the open window. She poured 2 cups of coffee into her mismatched mugs, the ones she and her late husband had bought at a flea market decades ago. Thomas sat at the table, setting the pie between them. "This place smells like home," he remarked. Margaret smiled faintly and then, almost without planning to, began to tell him the outlines of her story, Emma's whispers, Sarah's strange behavior, the cold looks at the market. Her voice trembled but she spoke clearly. Thomas listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around the coffee mug. When she finished, he leaned back, brows drawn together. Sarah Whitmore, he said slowly. I remember that name. She used to work at St. Mary's Hospital, right? Margaret nodded, twisting her wedding band nervously. Yes. She still does night shifts there. He exhaled through his nose, thinking. If you want, he said after a pause, lowering his voice, I can help you check a few things. Not officially, of course, but after 30 years on the force you pick up a few ways to find answers. Margaret's throat tightened. You really believe me? She asked softly, her fingers trembling on the edge of the table. Thomas met her eyes without flinching. Ma'am, I've spent my life telling truth from lies. I don't know the whole story yet, but I believe a grandmother's intuition over neighborhood gossip any day. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. For the first time in days, she wasn't completely alone. She reached for the apple pie, cutting 2 slices. Thank you, Mr. Reed, she murmured. You don't know how much this means. Outside, the evening sun slanted across the street, casting long golden shadows as if signaling the start of a new chapter in the fight she knew she had to face. That evening, the air over Maple Street carried the faint smell of damp leaves and gasoline from a neighbor's lawnmower. Inside Margaret's kitchen, the clock on the wall ticked softly while Emma colored quietly at the table, Snowy the rabbit tucked under her arm. Margaret was wiping down the counter when a knock came at the back door. She opened it to see Thomas Reed standing there, his gray windbreaker zipped up against the chill. In one hand he held a battered laptop case, in the other a thermos of coffee. Mind if I come in? He asked in his steady, low voice. I've got something you need to see. Margaret's stomach tightened. Of course, she said, stepping aside. Come to the dining room. Emma, sweetheart, why don't you go watch your cartoon for a bit? Thomas set the laptop on the small oak table that still bore faint knife scratches from years of family dinners. He unzipped the case and began plugging in cables with practiced movements. I asked my nephew Ryan to pull the security footage from the corner store a block over, he said quietly, eyes focused on the screen. He's good with these things. Margaret poured coffee into 2 mugs, her hands trembling slightly. What did he find? Thomas glanced at her briefly, his face grave. See for yourself. He turned the screen so she could watch. The grainy black and white footage flickered to life. It showed the rear alley behind Sarah's house the previous night. A figure in a dark coat appeared, Sarah, her hair messy, moving quickly. She was holding the hand of a boy, maybe 7 years old, with brown hair sticking out in tufts. His left arm was clumsily wrapped in a bandage. The child kept looking over his shoulder, his steps hesitant. Margaret felt her chest tighten as if a fist had gripped her heart. She set the coffee mug down but it rattled against the saucer, spilling a little. Oh my God, she whispered, eyes locked on the screen. That's not Emma. That's not any child I've ever seen. The footage showed Sarah unlocking the small shed at the back of the yard, the one Margaret had always thought was just for tools, and ushering the boy inside. She glanced around nervously before closing the door. The time stamp read 11:48 p.m. Margaret's knees felt weak. She reached out for the edge of the table. Thomas, tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me this is real. Thomas gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his palm warm and steady. You're not crazy, he said firmly. You had every right to be worried. This is the first real proof. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, her breath coming fast. A mix of terror and vindication surged through her. She wasn't imagining things, but the truth was worse than she'd feared. We can't keep this to ourselves, she said at last, her voice breaking. We have to take it to the police immediately. Thomas nodded, closing the laptop with a soft click. I'll go with you, he said simply. Margaret looked over at Emma in the next room, still humming softly to the cartoon on TV, completely unaware. She straightened her back, wiped at the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, and whispered, for the sake of that boy, and for Emma too, we have to do this now. Outside, the wind rose, scattering more leaves across the yard as if the world itself was urging them to move before it was too late. The next morning broke gray and damp, the kind of Portland morning where mist hangs low over the rooftops and the smell of wet pine fills the air. Margaret buttoned her old blue cardigan, the one Alex had given her years ago, and slipped the laptop Thomas had brought into a canvas tote. Emma was still asleep on the couch, curled up with Snowy. Margaret brushed a strand of hair off the girl's forehead, whispered, "I'll be back soon, sweetheart," and quietly closed the door behind her. Her steps echoed on the cracked sidewalk of Burnside Street as she made her way to the police station. The building loomed ahead, a squat, brick structure with a faded flag flapping in the drizzle. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a pale, cold glow. The scent of burnt coffee and paper files was unmistakable. At the front desk sat Officer Miller, a broad man in his 50s with a kind but wary face. He looked up, clearly recognizing her. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, setting down his mug. "Back again?" There was no malice in his tone, just a hint of fatigue, as if he'd seen too many worried grandmothers with nothing but hunches. Margaret straightened her shoulders, clutching the tote as if it were armor. "Yes," she said evenly. "But today I'm not here with a story. I have proof." She carefully lifted the laptop from her bag and set it on the counter. Her fingers trembled as she opened the screen and navigated to the video file Thomas had given her. Miller raised an eyebrow, leaning closer as the footage began to play. Within seconds, his expression shifted from polite patience to a furrowed brow. That's not your granddaughter?" Margaret shook her head. "No. This is a different boy. My granddaughter told me he's locked in a shed behind my daughter-in-law's house." Her voice caught on the last words, but she forced herself to stay steady. "Please. Just watch it through." The door to the back office opened and Detective Carlos Vega stepped out. At 41, with dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples and a crisp shirt rolled at the sleeves, he had the presence of someone who listened more than he spoke. Miller waved him over. "Carlos, you'll want to see this." Margaret's heart pounded as the detective studied the video in silence, one hand on his chin. When the clip ended, he exhaled sharply and looked up. "This boy isn't yours?" he asked again, confirming. "No," Margaret repeated. "He's a stranger. And my granddaughter says he's hurt." Carlos turned to a young officer at a computer. "Pull up the missing kids database. Start with boys under 10 reported in the last month." He looked back at Margaret, his voice measured but not unkind. "Have a seat over there, ma'am. We'll check right now." Margaret nodded, sinking onto a hard plastic chair against the wall. Her palms were damp, clutching the tote on her lap. Around her the station buzzed with low voices and ringing phones, but she heard only the rush of her own pulse. She stared at the linoleum floor, praying that this time, finally, someone would believe her before it was too late. Minutes dragged by like hours in the humming police station. Margaret sat on the hard plastic chair, her tote bag clutched against her chest. She watched the young officer at the computer tapping furiously, his brow furrowed. The faint sound of a printer, the distant ring of a phone, and the smell of burnt coffee all pressed around her, making her feel as though she were trapped in a waiting room between hope and despair. Suddenly the door to the records room swung open. A young officer with close-cropped hair and a slightly wrinkled uniform came out at a brisk pace, holding a folder. His voice was low but urgent. "Detective Vega," he called, glancing at Margaret. "I think we have a match." Carlos Vega crossed the room in 3 strides, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood. "Show me," he said. The officer handed him the folder and pointed to the computer screen still glowing with the boy's photo. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She rose halfway from her seat, her hands trembling. "Who is it?" she whispered, though no one had yet spoken. Carlos turned the folder toward her. A grainy school portrait stared up at her, a small boy with tousled brown hair, a shy smile, and a bandage visible just under his sleeve. The resemblance to the boy in the video was unmistakable. Carlos' voice was measured but heavy. Mrs. Hayes, if this information is correct, the child in your video may be Ethan Brooks. He's 7. Reported missing 2 weeks ago in Salem. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. Oh dear God, she murmured, one hand going to her mouth. Tears pricked her eyes, but she forced herself to stand straight. Detective, please, she said, her voice breaking. Please save that boy. Don't let him suffer another night. Carlos closed the folder with a quiet snap. He met her eyes, the weight of his job clear in his face. I understand, ma'am. But we need to do this by the book. We'll have to obtain a search warrant immediately. In the meantime, you must remain calm and under no circumstances alert Sarah to what's happening. Margaret nodded vigorously, though her knees felt weak. She gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. I won't say a word, she promised. I just want him safe. Carlos placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Good. Sit tight. I'll start the paperwork now. He turned to the young officer. Call the judge on duty. Get the warrant started. Notify Child Services and Salem PD. Margaret sank back down, the cold seat biting through her skirt. Inside she felt a wild mixture of hope and terror. She could almost see Alex's face, her son, looking at her from somewhere above, urging her to stay strong. She thought of Emma at home with Snowy, waiting. She whispered under her breath, Hold on, Ethan. Help is coming. The detective's phone rang sharply as he strode toward his office, and Margaret watched him disappear through the door, knowing that whatever happened next would change all of their lives. The living room of the little wooden house was dim except for the soft glow of the lamp on the end table. Rain pattered steadily against the windows, each drop sounding like a drumbeat in Margaret's chest. She sat on the old plaid sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching Emma huddle in the corner of the couch with Snowy, the worn-out bunny. The child's small shoulders trembled under her knit sweater. Margaret leaned a little closer, lowering her voice as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. Emma, sweetheart, you can tell Grandma anything, she murmured. No matter how scary it feels. For a long moment Emma only stared at Snowy, running her fingers over the rabbit's frayed ear. Then, in a voice so thin it was barely audible, she whispered, His name is Ethan. Her lips quivered. Mom says he has to stay there, because he's being punished. Margaret felt her breath catch, a sharp ache shooting through her chest. She forced herself not to gasp. Punished, she repeated softly. Darling, what do you mean? Emma's eyes filled with tears. She hugged Snowy tighter as if the toy could protect her from what she was about to say. He cries all the time. He says his arm hurts. But Mom says he's bad, and he has to stay in the shed until he learns. The words came out broken, like pieces of glass spilling from a child's mouth. Margaret reached out and gently cupped Emma's cheek. Emma, listen to me, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You are safe here with me. And we are going to help Ethan, I promise. But right now you need to stay close to Grandma and not be afraid. Emma's lower lip trembled. I'm scared, she confessed, finally meeting Margaret's eyes. I'm scared Mom will be mad at me for telling you. Margaret smoothed the child's hair back from her damp forehead, fighting to keep her own tears from falling. Your mom is having problems, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make very wrong choices, she said softly. But that doesn't mean you have to keep secrets that hurt someone. Grandma will not let anyone harm you or Ethan. Do you understand? Emma sniffled and gave a tiny nod. Do you really promise? She asked in a shaky voice. Margaret pulled her into a warm embrace, feeling the small heart beating fast against her own. I promise, she whispered into the child's hair, the words tasting like an oath she could never break. Outside, the Portland rain drummed harder on the tin roof, a relentless rhythm echoing Margaret's resolve. She rocked Emma gently, back and forth, just as she had rocked Alex when he was small. Inside, a storm of fear and determination swirled, but she held the girl tighter, her eyes fixed on the window's dark reflection. She would not let this night pass without acting. In that moment, as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance and Emma clung to her like a lifeline, Margaret silently vowed, whatever it took, she would protect her granddaughter, and she would bring Ethan out of that shed alive. That night, the little house on Maple Street felt like a ship adrift before a storm. Margaret moved quietly through the rooms, her slippers whispering against the worn hardwood floor. The clock on the mantel ticked with an exaggerated slowness, each second stretching her nerves tighter. Emma was finally asleep in the spare room, curled under the patchwork quilt, snowy clutched tight. Margaret had packed a small overnight bag for her granddaughter, a change of clothes, her toothbrush, and a pair of pink socks with dancing kittens, in case the police needed to take Emma somewhere safe. She zipped the bag and set it gently by the front door, her hands trembling. In the soft glow of the hallway light, the framed photo of Alex caught her eye. He was smiling in his hard hat, holding baby Emma high above his shoulders, her tiny hands reaching for the sky. Margaret stepped closer, running her fingers over the glass. "Alex," she whispered, her voice cracking, "help me protect her. Help me protect that boy." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Outside, the October wind howled down Maple Street, rattling the old windows. A gust slipped through a loose pane, sending a shiver through Margaret's thin cardigan. She wrapped it tighter around herself and sat down on the edge of the sofa, staring at the shadowy outline of the front door. In her mind she replayed Sarah's face from that evening, the pale skin, the darting eyes, the way she'd whispered to Emma like someone being watched. She wasn't just scared, Margaret murmured to herself. She was pleading. The thought twisted her stomach. Maybe Sarah wasn't a monster. Maybe someone else was forcing her into this horror. Margaret pressed her palms together, her knuckles widening. Whatever the reason, she breathed, that boy has to get out. She stood up and walked into the kitchen, putting the kettle on out of habit though she had no appetite for tea. The red digits of the microwave blinked 12 a.m. midnight. She imagined Ethan, 7 years old, hurt and frightened, sitting in a cold shed somewhere in the dark, waiting for someone to open the door. Her eyes stung. A sudden flash of light sliced across the living room wall. She hurried to the window and peeked through the curtain. A patrol car eased down the street, its headlights sweeping over the houses like a searchlight. For a heartbeat, hope surged through her. Tomorrow the police would act. Tomorrow there would be answers. She let the curtain fall back and took a deep, steadying breath. Turning off the kettle, she returned to the hallway and touched the packed bag once more, reassuring herself it was ready. Then she leaned against the doorframe of Emma's room, watching the child sleep. "Tomorrow," she whispered so softly the word barely left her lips. "Tomorrow we'll bring Ethan home." The wind outside rose again, a low moan through the maple trees, as Margaret stood in the dim light, sleepless, resolute, and praying the dawn would come quickly. The phone rang just as the first streaks of pale Portland light seeped through the kitchen blinds. Margaret's hands, already trembling from a sleepless night, jumped at the sound. She snatched up the receiver before the second ring. "Mrs. Hayes?" Detective Vega's voice was firm but gentler than before. "We've secured the warrant. We'll be there in 20 minutes to pick you and your granddaughter up. You'll be safe with us during the operation." Margaret pressed the phone tighter to her ear. "Thank you," she whispered, though her throat felt dry as paper. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure Emma, still asleep in the next room, could hear it. She hung up, leaning against the counter for a moment, palms flat on the cool laminate to steady herself. This was it. No more waiting, no more praying in the dark. She moved into the small bedroom and knelt beside the bed. Emma lay curled under the quilt, snowy sworn ear clutched between tiny fingers. "Emma, sweetheart, wake up," Margaret murmured, smoothing the child's tangled hair. Emma blinked up, confused, her cheeks pale. "Is it time to go, Grandma?" she asked in a small voice. "Yes, darling. We're going with the police now," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're going to help that boy. Everything will be okay." Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights reflected off the maple trees outside as two unmarked police SUVs pulled up. Margaret wrapped a thick scarf around Emma's neck, then her own. She lifted the little overnight bag she had prepared and opened the front door. A brisk autumn wind rushed in, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Two officers approached, one a young woman with a warm expression. "Morning, Mrs. Hayes," she said quietly. "We'll take you both to the safe house until Detective Vega gives the all-clear." Margaret nodded, clutching Emma close as they guided them to the car. Emma's small hand squeezed her grandmother's so tight it hurt. Inside the back seat of the SUV, the city rolled past in gray streaks. What had always been a short drive felt endless now. Margaret's eyes kept darting to the mirror, watching the second SUV tailing them, loaded with tactical gear and officers in dark jackets. Emma leaned into her side, whispering, "Grandma, I'm scared." Margaret kissed the top of her head, fingers stroking the girl's knuckles. "I'm scared too, sweetheart," she admitted softly. "But we're doing the right thing. We have to help Ethan. We have to." Outside, the maple leaves burned red against the slate sky, spiraling down in gusts that rattled the car windows. The weather felt like a warning and a promise at once, a storm about to break. Margaret stared out, her jaw set. In her lap, Emma clung to Snowy as though to an anchor. Margaret drew her close and whispered, "Hold on tight, baby. Whatever happens next, you're safe with me." As the convoy turned down Sarah Street, Margaret felt the weight of every heartbeat. They were almost there. The convoy rolled to a stop at the curb in front of Sarah Whitmore's neat blue-gray bungalow on Maple Street, its small front yard littered with wet autumn leaves. Margaret sat rigid in the back seat of the first SUV, her fingers laced so tightly around Emma's hand that her knuckles had gone white. She could hear the low murmur of police radios and the metallic click of weapons being checked. "Stay close to me, sweetheart," she whispered, bending down so her forehead touched Emma's. "It's almost over." Emma's lips trembled. "Grandma, is Mom going to be mad?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I don't know, baby. But no matter what happens, you're safe." Detective Vega opened Margaret's door. "Mrs. Hayes, you can stay in the car with Emma. We'll handle this." His dark eyes were calm but sharp, scanning the property. Margaret nodded, pulling the child onto her lap. Through the windshield she watched the officers fan out, two toward the backyard, two more to the front porch. The morning sky was heavy and gray, threatening rain, and the wind rattled the branches like dry bones. Vega and another detective climbed the porch steps. He raised his fist and pounded on the door with a flat, echoing thud. "Portland Police Department. Ms. Whitmore, open the door." A pause. Then the door creaked open just a few inches, and Sarah's pale face appeared in the gap. Her hair was unbrushed, eyes rimmed red as if she hadn't slept. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, voice rising in panic. "You can't just." Vega held up a folded document, his voice clipped and official. "We have a search warrant signed by Judge Morales." "Step aside, ma'am." Sarah pushed the door wider, trembling. "There's nothing here. You're making a mistake." Her gaze darted past the officers toward the street, and for a split second her eyes locked with Margaret's through the car window, a look of desperation, like a drowning person searching for a hand. Margaret's stomach twisted. The officers moved inside quickly, one leading Sarah toward the living room while the others peeled off to the hallway and kitchen. From the backyard came the sound of boots crunching over gravel as two officers approached the small weathered shed that matched the video Thomas had shown. Its padlock hung heavy and rusty on the door. Suddenly Sarah's composure cracked. She lunged toward the back door, shouting, "Don't open it. It's not what you think." Tears streamed down her face. "It's Ethan's fault. He made me do it." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She wrapped her arms around Emma, who had begun to cry softly. Inside the shed, Vega produced a master key and knelt by the lock. "Back up," he told his partner. With a sharp twist, the padlock popped open. The door groaned on its hinges as it swung inward, releasing a cold, sour smell of mildew and unwashed blankets. A single bare bulb swung overhead, casting a weak glow into the shadows. Margaret could see Vega's silhouette in the doorway, still for a heartbeat, then leaning forward. What lay beyond that door would change everything. The inside of the shed was colder than anyone expected. Damp air clung to the officers' coats, and the single bare bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows over stacks of boxes and a moldy mattress in the corner. For a long, suspended moment, there was only silence, then a faint sound, so soft it could have been the wind. "Help me." Detective Vega raised his flashlight and swept the beam across the clutter. The light landed on a tiny figure crouched behind an old trunk. A boy with tangled brown hair, his face streaked with dirt and dried tears, blinked into the brightness like a startled animal. One arm was wrapped in a filthy bandage that hung loose at the elbow. "It's okay, buddy," Vega said gently, lowering his voice. "We're the police. You're safe now." The boy staggered out, bare feet slapping against the cold concrete floor. His thin shoulders trembled, his wide eyes darting from the officers to the door, as if afraid this was another trick. Margaret, who had stepped from the car despite being told to stay inside, stopped dead at the threshold. Her knees gave out and she clutched the doorframe for balance. "Oh God." "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. Emma stood a few paces behind her grandmother, clutching Snowy to her chest. She had gone completely still, eyes fixed on the boy she had whispered about just days earlier. Her lower lip quivered. "That's him," she breathed, almost inaudible. "That's Ethan." Margaret covered her mouth with one trembling hand, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She wanted to rush forward and wrap the boy in a blanket, to promise him everything would be all right, but her feet wouldn't move. The smell of mildew and cold earth mixed with the sound of the child's small, ragged breaths until the world seemed to tilt. Behind them, Sarah struggled in the grip of two uniformed officers, her hair falling loose over her face. "I didn't want to do this," she screamed, voice raw. "They made me keep him. You don't understand, they threatened me." Her words echoed off the tin walls of the shed, frantic and wild. Detective Vega flicked his eyes to his partner and jerked his chin toward the door. "Call EMS now," he ordered. "And notify Child Services. He's coming out." One officer stepped forward with a blanket, draping it gently over Ethan's shoulders. The boy flinched at first, then sagged into the warmth, a tiny whimper escaping his throat. Out on the street, neighbors had begun to gather behind the police tape, their murmurs rising like a guilty chorus. "I thought I heard something," one woman muttered, wringing her hands. "God forgive us," another whispered. Margaret turned toward Emma and crouched to meet her eyes. "It's over now, sweetheart," she said softly, voice still trembling. "You were brave to tell me." Emma sniffled, burying her face in Snowy's worn fur. Margaret straightened and looked once more at Ethan as he was led out into the pale daylight. She felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness mingled with relief. The nightmare had been dragged into the open. A child had been saved from the shadows, and though the cost was heavy, at least the truth had finally come to light. As Ethan was carried out of the shed wrapped in the blanket, a hush fell over the crowd. The flashing lights reflected off wet pavement, casting streaks of blue and red against the houses. Margaret stood still for a long moment, holding Emma close. She could feel the child's heart hammering against her own. When she finally looked up, Ethan's frightened eyes met hers, and she gave him the smallest, trembling nod, a promise that this nightmare was over. Sarah's cries echoed from the patrol car where she sat handcuffed, her voice breaking into hoarse sobs. "I didn't want this," she kept repeating, "I didn't want this." Margaret felt no anger, only a hollow sadness. Somewhere beneath Sarah's mistakes there had been a mother who once smiled at family dinners, a woman who had perhaps been trapped by someone darker, by choices she could no longer control. Detective Vega approached Margaret, his expression softening. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "If you hadn't spoken up, we might never have found him." Margaret nodded, tears still shining on her cheeks. I couldn't stay silent. No child should be hidden away like that, she whispered. She glanced down at Emma, who clutched Snowy with white knuckles but was looking up at her grandmother with something like relief. That evening, after the police had left and the crowd had dispersed, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the house finally quiet again. She brewed 2 mugs of cocoa, one for herself, one for Emma, and watched the steam curl into the air. It was over, at least the part she could control. A boy had been saved, and a little girl had been heard. This story is a painful reminder that courage often begins in the quietest places, in a whispered confession from a child, or in the decision of one adult to believe it. Listening, speaking up, and protecting the vulnerable can truly change lives. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Leave a comment saying I'm listening so we can stay connected and continue this journey together. See you in the next video.